On a fog-drenched morning in Charleston County, 1823, 7 shackles lay open on the ground. The slaves they once bound had vanished, leaving behind only a blood-stained parchment signed with the seal of Colonel Thaddius Ravencraftoft. Witnesses swore the paper reeked of iron and ash, as though the ink itself had been mixed with human suffering. But the words were worse than the stain, an agreement so grotesque, so precise, that it destroyed not only a family dynasty, but warped the very order of Southern aristocracy. You were never meant to hear these words, because history does not reward those who know what truly transpired. And yet, here you are. What would compel a decorated colonel, a man who owned thousands of acres and commanded absolute loyalty, to give his new bride 7 enslaved souls as her wedding gift? And why was this gift not gold, not land, not jewels, but a family chosen to be broken, reforged, and used as an experiment? Tonight, you will descend with me into a story scrubbed from textbooks and sealed in archives, the agreement that turned a marriage bed into a chamber of psychological warfare and a plantation into a living laboratory of cruelty. To understand the horror of what Colonel Ravencraftoft signed, you must first grasp who he was. Tall, broad-shouldered, his war record from 1812 had carved him into a man worshipped by Charleston society. His grey eyes saw not people, but strategies, not families, but numbers on ledgers. The Ravencraftoft plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Carolina soil, and he ruled it like a fortress. But the colonel's power did not exist alone. It demanded a stage, an audience, a wife who would elevate him into the aristocratic pantheon. Cordelia Peton was that woman, only 23, but already infamous for her ambition. She had grown up amid Savannah's wealth, where human lives were auctioned as easily as sugar and seam. Autumn. Most brides asked for pearls, gowns, or property. Cordelia asked for something no Southern lady had ever demanded: absolute legal ownership of 7 specific enslaved individuals, not shared, not symbolic, her private experiment beyond her husband's authority, a family to dissect, a dynasty to control. The colonel should have laughed. Instead, he admired her cruelty, mistaking it for intelligence. He saw in her not a wife, but a partner in power. That mistake, signing her paper, was the moment the dynasty began to rot. The 7 chosen were not random. Cordelia had studied them as if they were specimens, not souls. Their names were Cain, a family line that had served the plantation for generations. Joshua, the blacksmith, his hands could bend iron like clay. Rebecca, the seamstress, her fingers wove garments finer than merchants could import. Their children: Samuel, broad-shouldered and obedient yet quick-witted; Mary, a healer with knowledge of herbs passed down through whispers; David, whose youth masked a dangerous strength; and then Mary's children, ages 6 and 9. Innocent bloodlines, Cordelia saw not as children but as clay to be molded. To Cordelia, they were not people. They were a controlled experiment, a perfect group, she wrote in her notes. 1 generation to break, another to rewire, a third to shape into something new. She spoke of them with the same cheerful tone she used when selecting silverware patterns. To Ravencraftoft, this was genius. To Cordelia, this was destiny. And to the Cain family, it was the beginning of a nightmare no plantation field could equal. For the agreement was not about labor, it was about control, breeding, and the destruction of the human soul itself, repackaged as progress. October 1822. The Ravencraftoft plantation shimmered with silk ribbons and French champagne, a theater of wealth meant to announce not just a marriage, but a dynasty. 200 guests arrived in carriages that clogged the dirt roads for miles. Governors, senators, judges, men who bent laws as easily as bark, stood shoulder to shoulder under oak canopies. Cordelia appeared radiant in imported French silk, Ravencraftoft in his gleaming military dress. But beneath the orchestras and laughter, a darker script waited. When the ceremony ended, the groom stepped forward for the gift presentation, a tradition where a man offered jewels, carriages, or land to his bride. Ravencraftoft's voice carried like cannon fire. My beloved Cordelia has asked for something far more practical. 7 souls, chosen for their strength, their skills, and their potential. To her, they belong. The garden hushed. Some nodded approvingly, calling it genius. Others forced smiles, unease prickling at the edges. Only a few, men of medicine and the cloth, recognized the language of experiments, the words of cruelty masquerading as progress. But while guests toasted, those 7 were already torn from their families, marched to a hidden outbuilding in the forest. The wedding feast was their funeral procession. None of the guests knew it. 2 miles from the mansion, through a path swallowed by pines, stood a building disguised as a textile workshop. To guests, it was nothing. To Cordelia, it was the crucible of her new order. Reinforced walls, barred windows, and chambers carved into isolation cells. She had designed it herself. At the center stood the instruction room, a chamber lined with restraints, tools, and devices far more precise than any whipping post. Cordelia believed cruelty wasted energy. She wanted something colder, psychological domination. The Cain family was separated immediately. Each Ember was given a cell, forbidden to see the others except under her supervision. Meals were staggered, conversations punished. Soon the silence between them grew louder than any lash. Cordelia then began her true experiment. The destruction of trust. She whispered false reports to father and son, telling each the other had betrayed him. She told the mother that her daughter's obedience spared her punishment, then inflicted punishment anyway. Lies became poison, turning love into suspicion, suspicion into isolation. And when suspicion alone was not enough, she introduced productivity bonding, a system where one family member's performance determined whether the others ate or suffered. It was no longer survival, it was forced betrayal. By winter, the Cain family no longer spoke as kin. Joshua, once the unshakable blacksmith, began to doubt his son's loyalty, believing Cordelia's poisonous whispers. Rebecca wept silently into her hands at night, convinced her daughter had condemned her to extra punishment. Samuel, broad-shouldered and proud, now carried the shame of believing his own father had asked for harsher treatment against him. Even little David began competing against his sister's children, terrified that his failures would bring lashes to their small backs. Cordelia watched with clinical precision, writing notes in elegant script. Family bonds weakening, increased compliance evident, fear redirected from punishment toward kinship itself, promising results. This was her genius, turning the strongest weapon the enslaved had, their unity, into their greatest curse. When one failed, all suffered. When one excelled, suspicion followed. By January, they were no longer family, but fragments, isolated bodies in orbit around Cordelia's will. And Ravencraftoft? He read her notes with fascination, convinced they had discovered a system that could revolutionize the South. He called it innovation, she called it progress. But in truth, it was neither. It was an altar, and on it, the Cain family had been sacrificed piece by piece. Secrets never stay buried, not even on plantations built on silence. By February, whispers began to leak. A stable boy swore he heard children crying from the workshop long after midnight. A house servant carrying linens glimpsed Cordelia's leather portfolio filled with diagrams of restraints and schedules that looked more like military campaigns than plantation records. Even the county physician, Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, noticed something off. He had been summoned once, told to examine Samuel after an accident with tools. But Samuel's wrists bore marks too clean, too deliberate, as though designed to measure endurance rather than correct behavior. Fitzgerald left shaken, muttering to his wife that Ravencraftoft's new wife runs her household as though God himself never existed. Yet the guests of Charleston's elite continued to drink champagne in the Ravencraftoft drawing room, charmed by Cordelia's wit, blind to the stench of decay spreading just beyond the pine trees. Only Reverend Hartwell pressed further, warning in sermons that the devil dresses himself not in rags, but in silks and smiles. He did not name names. He did not dare. Because men who crossed the Ravencraftofts often found themselves silenced, sometimes by scandal, sometimes by soil. Cordelia's appetite for control was never satisfied. Isolation and betrayal had weakened the Cain family, but she wanted permanence. Pain fades, fear dulls. She needed obedience written into bloodlines. That spring, she introduced what her notes called generation molding. She separated Mary the healer from her children and forced her into controlled breeding arrangements with men chosen not for affection, but for traits, strength, endurance, silence. Cordelia kept meticulous records, height, muscle, compliance levels, even recovery time from punishment. The children were not spared. The youngest were drilled wit, tasks beyond their years, denied rest until their tiny hands blistered. She whispered to them that their mother's failures caused their pain, while telling Mary her children thrived when she obeyed. It was a system so insidious it turned love itself into a weapon. Ravencraftoft reviewed her ledgers with fascination. To him, this was science, a new order of plantation management. He boasted to allies that his wife had achieved what overseers never could, obedience without the whip, loyalty without trust. But those allies never saw the blood-stained straw, the sleepless eyes, the quiet sobs that filled the workshop. To Cordelia, it was progress. To the Cain family, it was damnation. By summer of 1852, rumors spread beyond Charleston's high society. Rivals of Ravencraftoft, men jealous of his rising influence, began to whisper about the wife who runs experiments in the dark. Merchants heard strange tales from wagon drivers who swore the Cain children looked more like prisoners than workers, their eyes empty, their backs scarred in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. One visitor, a planter from Savannah, stumbled upon Cordelia's workshop by accident. What he saw, charts nailed to the walls, rows of instruments polished not for farming but for restraint, left him shaken. He fled before supper, telling his companions that Charleston hid a new kind of cruelty, one that feeds on the soul. Even enslaved communities miles away began to murmur of the place where family dies, warning runaways never to cross Ravencraftoft land. Yet Cordelia and her husband welcomed guests with grace, their estate gleaming, their reputation growing. What no one outside saw was the Cain family breaking into fragments so small they could barely remember their own names. The plantation itself seemed cursed, fields heavy with silence, air thick with unease. The Cain family was no longer living, they were being studied. In October, the Ravencraftoft estate received visitors unlike any before. Not neighboring planters, but men who arrived in carriages drawn by black horses, their coats too fine for the dirt roads. They introduced themselves as investors, though their names rarely appeared in public ledgers. Some whispered they were tied to secret societies that moved quietly beneath Charleston's surface, weaving influence through banking, shipping, and politics. Cordelia led them proudly into her workshop, unveiling her ledgers and charts as though revealing discoveries to a board of scholars. The men studied her notes with fascination, the timed punishments, the group accountability, the breeding records. One leaned close and muttered, "This is not management, this is architecture." Ravencraftoft smiled, puffing his pipe, while Cordelia's eyes gleamed with something colder. The investors spoke of expansion, of plantations across Georgia and Virginia adopting her methods, creating a network of order. They toasted her brilliance over brandy, calling her not mistress, but architect of compliance. Yet behind the polished smiles, the Cain family endured torments unfit for words. Their pain was no longer just suffering, it was data. Their lives, stripped of dignity, had become the blueprint for a system far larger than themselves. It was Samuel who broke first, the broad-shouldered son who had once believed his strength alone could carry his family. Months of humiliation had stripped him, but not extinguished him. One night, after Cordelia forced him to kneel while she measured his endurance against fire-heated irons, Samuel snapped. He rose in the dark hours before dawn, chains still raw against his wrists, and whispered to his father, Joshua, "Better we die free than live as her numbers." Joshua's eyes, tired and hollow, flickered with something long buried. They began to plan in pairs, small acts at first, tools hidden, schedules disrupted, silent signals passed between siblings during forced labor. Mary risked everything, stealing pages from Cordelia's ledgers when left unattended, hiding them under floorboards. Even little David played his part, faking illness to buy his family fragments of rest. For the first time in months, the Cains felt not broken, but bound again, this time by resistance. Yet Cordelia was not blind. Her notes began to darken. Signs of cohesion resurfacing, must recalibrate. She had anticipated rebellion, she welcomed it, because to her every act of resistance was not defiance. It was another experiment to be dissected. The Cain family's defiance lasted only weeks before Cordelia struck. One evening, as the sun bled red across the fields, she summoned them all to the workshop. On the table lay Mary's stolen ledger pages she thought hidden beneath the floorboards. Cordelia's voice was calm, almost tender. "You believe yourselves clever, but cleverness is only useful when it builds, not when it destroys." She ordered them bound together, father, mother, sons, daughters, lashed side by side like one body. Then she introduced a new device, an iron frame with pulleys and weights, designed so that the movement of one body strained the others. If Joshua shifted, Samuel screamed. If Rebecca wept, David's wrists bled. She forced them to endure the night in that grotesque embrace, documenting every detail. Heart rate, cries, collapse. By dawn, they were trembling shadows of themselves. Cordelia noted, resistance destabilized by collective punishment magnified, unity transformed into shared torment. Highly effective. Ravencraftoft, ever proud, called it brilliant beyond cruelty. But Samuel did not break. He stared at Cordelia through swollen eyes and whispered, "You may own my body, but you will never own my hate." And in that moment, Cordelia realized her experiment was far from over. Samuel's words should have vanished in the straw, drowned by the clank of chains and the scratch of Cordelia's pen, but they lingered. "You will never own my hate." It was more than defiance. It was contagion. David whispered it under his breath as he hauled buckets. Rebecca mouthed it in the dark as she lay bruised. Even Joshua, the man Cordelia had broken with suspicion, began to repeat it in prayer, his voice trembling but steady. Something stirred among the enslaved beyond the Cain family too. Servants who glimpsed Samuel's burning stare carried whispers to the quarters, that the Ravencraftoft witch could measure flesh but not spirit, that her experiments bred obedience but also fury. Cordelia sensed the shift. Her notes grew frantic. Emergent solidarity, emotional contagion unpredictable, variables must be contained. But the more she punished, the more the word spread. Samuel had given them a weapon no ledger could quantify, a belief that suffering could be endured, but hatred was theirs alone, untouchable. Ravencraftoft dismissed it as nothing, but Cordelia knew better. Control was never absolute, and in the smallest cracks of her perfect design, something wild had begun to grow. Cordelia's response was swift and merciless. She could not allow words to become weapons, nor defiance to become faith. One night, under a moon veiled in clouds, she ordered the Cain family dragged back into the workshop. This time, there was no lecture, no scientific calm, only silence, broken by the clatter of chains and the hiss of heated iron. She forced them to watch one another suffer. Mary whipped until her back split, Rebecca's hair shorn to the scalp. David forced to hold stones until his arms collapsed. Samuel was made to kneel as each torment was inflicted, Cordelia whispering, "Your words did this. Your pride destroys them." But Samuel did not beg. His silence was more dangerous than his defiance, and Cordelia knew it. So she escalated. In her ledger she wrote, "If one cannot be broken, the others must be reshaped through him. His body will be the crucible, their terror the alloy. Ravencraftoft watched with detached admiration, but even he shifted uneasily at her intensity. Yet Cordelia pressed on, convinced that only total annihilation of spirit could seal her triumph. What she could not see was that her cruelty was no longer producing obedience. It was birthing something else. Legend. By late 1823, the Cain family's suffering had begun to ripple through Charleston, carried in whispers and uneasy glances. Servants returning from secret errands spoke of strange cries from the pine forest. Children who had once laughed now silent specters. Rumors reached other plantations. A family destroyed by order, obedience manufactured through terror. Even among the city's elite, subtle unease grew. Guests who had once toasted Cordelia's brilliance now whispered in private, calling it unnatural, perverse, unholy. Yet none dared speak publicly for fear of scandal, influence, or worse. And the Cain family? By now they had learned to survive by a single defiant act, sharing a symbolic phrase in secret. Freedom lives in the mind. They repeated it twice, quietly, so even the youngest could remember. That phrase became their anchor, their silent rebellion. And for any who stumbled across this story today, I want you to do the same. Write, "Freedom lives in the mind," twice in the comments below. Let it lock in your awareness, your identity as someone who sees beyond the surface. The ritual is simple, but its power is profound. What Cordelia could not control, their minds, remained untouchable, a spark ready to ignite even in the darkest shadow. The Ravencraftoft dynasty never recovered. Cordelia's experiment yielded obedience, yes, but it also unleashed a ripple she could not contain. Word of the Cain family's torment leaked, first as rumor, then as scandal, and finally as obsession. Rivals seized the opportunity to undermine the colonel, spreading tales of cruelty that haunted Charleston's courts and drawing rooms for decades. The 7 individuals were freed in secret, scattered, their minds scarred, but their spirits unbroken. They carried with them the symbolic phrase, the quiet rebellion that Cordelia could never erase. As for Ravencraftoft, he died respected but reviled, a cautionary tale in whispers, that power wielded without conscience corrodes itself. Cordelia faded into history, remembered in fragmented letters, her brilliance and cruelty entwined like twin serpents. But the legacy of that one brutal agreement, the giving of a wife to 7 souls, lives on in the shadows of the South, a reminder that the machinery of control may dominate flesh, but never fully claim thought or will. And now you have walked these halls with me, seen the ledger, felt the chains. You carry that knowledge forward. Keep it close. Let it sharpen your understanding of power, obedience, and the terrifying fragility of the human soul when placed in the hands of those who see life as nothing more than a calculation